The morning fog clung to the runway at MacDill Air Force Base like a wet blanket, but Captain Sarah Chun could already feel the Florida humidity building despite the early hour. At 32, she possessed an unusual combination of analytical precision and intuitive flight instincts that had made her legendary among instructors at the Air Force Academy. Her simulator records remained unbroken after 6 years. She held advanced certifications in 3 different aircraft systems, and her understanding of aerodynamics had earned her recognition from MIT's Aerospace Engineering Department. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Yet for the past 18 months, she had been systematically excluded from every meaningful flight assignment that crossed Colonel Bradley Thompson's desk. The official reason was always the same: insufficient experience with operational protocols. The real reason was something Thompson would never put in writing, but something everyone on the base understood without discussion. Sarah's boots echoed against the concrete as she approached the flight operations building, her flight bag slung over her shoulder and her helmet tucked under her left arm. The morning briefing was scheduled for 0630 hours, and she had arrived 15 minutes early, as always. Through the glass doors, she could see the familiar faces of the squadron pilots gathering around the mission board, their flight suits crisp, and their attitudes confident. Major Rick Patterson spotted her first. His voice carried that particular brand of condescension that had become as familiar to Sarah as her own reflection. Well, if it isn't our resident desk jockey. Come to watch the real pilots plan their missions? The laughter that followed wasn't the good-natured ribbing that existed between squadron mates. It was sharp, deliberate, designed to establish hierarchy and remind everyone exactly where Sarah fit in the operational pecking order. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the Deputy Operations Commander, didn't laugh, but he didn't intervene either. His silence spoke volumes about the culture that had been allowed to flourish under Thompson's leadership. Sarah had learned to navigate these moments with practiced composure. She found an empty seat near the back of the briefing room and opened her mission folder, reviewing the day's assigned duties: weather analysis, flight plan reviews, and administrative support for the pilots who would actually be taking aircraft into the sky. It was important work, technically speaking, but it was also the kind of assignment that could be handled by any officer with basic flight training. Captain Tony Martinez leaned back in his chair, making sure his voice carried across the room. "Hey Chun, when you're done with the paperwork, maybe you can help us figure out the fuel calculations. I know math isn't everyone's strong suit, but we could use someone who's good with numbers." The suggestion drew more chuckles from the assembled pilots. What they didn't know was that Sarah had developed a new fuel efficiency algorithm during her graduate studies that had been quietly adopted by 3 different airlines. Her mathematical modeling had identified patterns in fuel consumption that had saved millions of dollars in operational costs. But that information existed in academic journals that none of them had ever bothered to read. The briefing room door opened with a sharp bang as Colonel Thompson entered, his presence immediately commanding attention. At 58, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had flown combat missions in 2 different conflicts and had strong opinions about who belonged in cockpits. His approach to military leadership was shaped by traditions that predated most of the technology currently filling the hangars outside. "Gentlemen," Thompson began, his eyes scanning the room and settling briefly on Sarah with obvious disapproval. "Today's training exercises will focus on advanced tactical maneuvers and combat readiness protocols. We have 6 F-16 Fighting Falcons scheduled for air-to-air training scenarios, and I want precision execution from every pilot involved." He clicked to the first slide of his presentation, displaying the day's flight assignments. Sarah's name appeared nowhere on the operational roster, despite having submitted formal requests for flight time every week for the past 4 months. Instead, she saw her designation listed under support personnel, with duties that would keep her firmly planted on the ground. Martinez, you'll be leading the first flight of 3 aircraft. Patterson, you'll take the second flight. Morrison will be monitoring from the tower and providing tactical oversight. Thompson's voice carried the authority of absolute command, but also something else that Sarah had learned to recognize over the months of exclusion. Major Patterson raised his hand. Sir, what about Chun? Doesn't she have some kind of flight background? The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Thompson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Sarah could feel every pair of eyes in the room turning toward her. This was the moment she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Captain Chun's qualifications are limited to theoretical knowledge and simulator training, Thompson replied, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. Real combat aircraft require practical experience that can only be gained through proper progression through the ranks. She'll be handling mission support duties. What Thompson didn't mention was that Sarah's theoretical knowledge included a master's degree in aeronautical engineering from Caltech, advanced training in combat systems analysis, and flight instructor certifications that exceeded the qualifications of half the pilots in the room. Her simulator scores weren't just impressive. They were record-breaking performances that had caught the attention of aircraft manufacturers who used her data to refine their training programs. The meeting continued with detailed discussions of flight patterns, communication protocols, and safety procedures. Sarah listened with the focused attention of someone who understood every technical detail being discussed, occasionally taking notes that went far beyond the basic information being presented. She had spent countless hours studying the F-16 systems, memorizing performance specifications, and analyzing combat scenarios that these pilots would encounter during their training exercises. As the briefing concluded, and the pilots began filing out toward the flight line, Sarah remained seated, reviewing her assigned duties for the day. Weather monitoring, communication support, and post-flight data analysis. Important work, but work that utilized perhaps 10% of her actual capabilities and training. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison approached her desk as the room emptied. His expression was neutral, but Sarah detected something in his manner that hadn't been there before. Chun, I've been reviewing your personnel file. Your academic background is pretty impressive. Sarah looked up from her paperwork, uncertain whether this was genuine interest or another setup for humiliation. Thank you, sir. I've always believed that understanding the theory behind flight operations makes for better practical application. Morrison nodded slowly. Your fuel efficiency research was published in the Journal of Aerospace Engineering, wasn't it? I remember reading something about algorithm optimization that caught my attention. The admission surprised Sarah. Morrison was the first person on the base who had acknowledged any aspect of her background beyond her gender and relative lack of operational flight hours. Most of the pilots treated her academic achievements as irrelevant abstractions that had no bearing on real-world aviation. Yes, sir. The research focused on optimizing fuel consumption patterns during extended flight operations. The mathematical models showed significant potential for cost savings across multiple aircraft types. Morrison's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sarah caught something in his eyes that suggested he was processing this information more carefully than his colleagues had. Interesting. Have you had any opportunity to apply those concepts practically? The question was loaded with implications that Sarah understood immediately. Morrison was asking whether she had actual flight experience beyond the simulator training that Thompson had dismissed so casually. The answer was complicated, because her flight time had been accumulated through civilian aviation programs and military training exercises that didn't appear on her official service record. Some practical application, sir. I've logged approximately 400 hours in various aircraft types, including civilian jets and military trainers. Most of that experience was gained during off-duty periods and advanced training programs. Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. 400 hours represented significant flight experience, far more than most pilots accumulated before their first operational assignments. The fact that Sarah had pursued this training independently, without official support or encouragement, suggested a level of dedication that impressed him despite his attempts to remain neutral. "That's considerably more experience than I would have expected," Morrison admitted. "Have you had any opportunity to work with military aircraft specifically?" Sarah hesitated, knowing that her answer would either open doors or close them permanently. "I've completed advanced training on F-16 systems through the Reserve Officer Training Corps program, sir. Simulator training, but also hands-on experience with aircraft maintenance, systems analysis, and flight preparation procedures." The information hung between them like a bridge that neither was quite ready to cross. Morrison understood the implications immediately. Sarah wasn't just a desk officer with theoretical knowledge. She was a qualified pilot who had been systematically excluded from flight operations, despite possessing the training and certification necessary to perform those duties. "I see," Morrison said quietly. "And Colonel Thompson is aware of this background?" The question touched the heart of the entire situation. Sarah had submitted detailed documentation of her qualifications, training records, and flight experience to Thompson's office multiple times. The paperwork had been reviewed, filed, and ignored with bureaucratic efficiency that suggested deliberate policy rather than administrative oversight. "Yes, sir. All of my training records and certifications have been submitted through proper channels. Colonel Thompson has indicated that additional operational experience would be required before flight assignments could be considered." Morrison nodded slowly, processing the diplomatic language that concealed months of frustration and systematic exclusion. He understood military bureaucracy well enough to recognize when regulations were being used as weapons rather than guidelines for operational efficiency. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of jet engines spinning up outside the building. Through the windows, they could see the F-16S being prepared for the morning's training exercises. Ground crews moved with practiced efficiency, checking systems, loading fuel, and preparing aircraft for pilots who would soon be demonstrating the skills that Sarah had been studying and perfecting for years. "Shun," Morrison said finally, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect. "Keep studying those manuals. You never know when an opportunity might present itself." The comment seemed casual, but Sarah detected an undercurrent of meaning that suggested Morrison was aware of more than he was willing to discuss openly. She had learned to read the subtle communications that existed beneath the surface of military interactions, and something in Morrison's manner suggested that changes might be coming to the rigid hierarchy that had defined her experience at MacDill. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Morrison left the briefing room, Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to report to her assigned station in the operations center. Outside, the sound of jet engines grew louder as the F-16s prepared for takeoff. She watched through the window as the aircraft taxied toward the runway, their pilots visible in the cockpits, preparing for training exercises that would test their skills and reflexes. What none of them knew was that Sarah had spent the previous evening reviewing classified intelligence reports about potential threats to air operations in the region. Her analytical background had allowed her to identify patterns in enemy aircraft movements that had escaped the attention of standard intelligence briefings. She had prepared a comprehensive tactical assessment that could significantly improve the effectiveness of the morning's training exercises, but that analysis would remain in her personal files, unused and unshared, because the operational culture at MacDill had no mechanism for incorporating insights from officers who didn't fit The traditional pilot profile. Sarah had learned to keep her observations to herself, understanding that offering unsolicited tactical advice would be interpreted as presumptuous rather than helpful. The morning was already heating up, and Sarah could feel the familiar weight of another day spent watching from the sidelines, while her skills and knowledge went unused. But something about Morrison's comment lingered in her mind, suggesting that the static situation she had endured for 18 months might be approaching a point of change. She had no way of knowing that events were already in motion that would soon provide the opportunity Morrison had hinted at. Within 72 hours, circumstances would arise that would finally allow Sarah to demonstrate whether her theoretical knowledge and simulator training could translate into the kind of practical performance that would silence her critics permanently. Sound of jet engines faded as the F-16S disappeared into the morning sky, leaving Sarah alone with her paperwork and the growing certainty that her patience was about to be rewarded in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The operations center hummed with the controlled chaos of a training day in full swing. Sarah settled into her assigned workstation, surrounded by banks of monitors displaying weather data, communication channels, and flight tracking information. From her position, she could monitor every aspect of the F-16 training exercises currently underway, but her role was strictly observational. She was there to compile reports, not to contribute tactical insights that might actually improve mission effectiveness. Colonel Thompson's office occupied the corner of the operations building, its large windows providing a commanding view of the entire flight line. The office itself was a monument to traditional military aviation, with photographs of Thompson in various cockpits spanning his 28-year career. Model aircraft lined the shelves, each representing a different phase of his progression through the ranks. It was the office of someone who had earned his authority through flight hours and combat experience, and who believed that same progression should be required of everyone else. The intercom crackled to life as Thompson's voice filled the operations center. "Captain Chun, report to my office immediately." The tone carried no warmth, no courtesy, just the expectation of immediate compliance that characterized all of Thompson's interactions with subordinates. He considered problematic. Sarah saved her work and walked across the operations floor, aware that every technician and officer in the room was watching her movement. Thompson's summons were never casual conversations, and everyone understood that being called to his office usually meant trouble of one kind or another. Thompson didn't look up from his paperwork when Sarah entered. The deliberate slight was calculated to establish dominance before the conversation even began. After a full minute of silence, he finally raised his eyes and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Chun. We need to discuss your future at this installation." The phrasing sent a chill through Sarah's chest. Discussions about future assignments in Thompson's vocabulary typically meant transfers to less desirable positions, or administrative roles that would effectively end any hope of advancement. She had seen it happen to other officers who had challenged the established order or failed to fit into Thompson's vision of military efficiency. "Sir, if this is about my request for flight assignments, I can provide additional documentation of my qualifications and training records." Thompson's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Chun, let me explain something to you about military aviation. Flying fighter jets isn't about simulator scores or academic degrees. It's about split-second decisions under pressure, physical endurance, and the kind of leadership that comes from earning respect through proven performance." He opened a file folder and spread several documents across his desk. Sarah recognized her own personnel records, training certifications, and performance evaluations. Thompson had been building a case, documenting every interaction and decision related to her assignment requests. "Your record shows impressive test scores and theoretical knowledge," Thompson continued, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone delivering a prepared speech. "But it also shows a pattern of unrealistic expectations and failure to understand the operational requirements of a combat-ready squadron. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she maintained the neutral expression that had served her through 18 months of similar conversations. Thompson's assessment ignored the substance of her qualifications while focusing on subjective interpretations of her attitude and expectations. "Sir, my flight training includes over 400 hours of actual flight time, including advanced tactical maneuvers and emergency procedures. My engineering background provides technical knowledge that could enhance mission planning and aircraft performance optimization." Thompson's expression hardened. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes you unsuitable for operational assignments. You believe your academic credentials substitute for real-world experience. You think your theories about fuel efficiency translate into combat readiness. You've convinced yourself that simulator time equals actual combat flight experience." The criticism struck at the heart of Sarah's deepest insecurities. She had spent years accumulating training and knowledge, but Thompson was right about one thing: she had never flown a combat mission. Her experience came from training environments and controlled scenarios, not from the unpredictable chaos of actual military operations. "Furthermore," Thompson continued, his voice rising slightly, "your persistent requests for flight assignments demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of military hierarchy and the decision-making process. I've made my position clear multiple times, yet you continue to submit paperwork as if repetition will somehow change the facts." The accusation was particularly galling because Sarah had followed proper channels for every request. She had submitted documentation through official procedures, attended required briefings, and maintained professional conduct throughout months of rejection. Thompson was characterizing her adherence to military protocol as insubordination. "Sir, I've followed all established procedures for requesting assignment consideration. My submissions include all required documentation and certifications. I'm not questioning your authority. I'm requesting opportunities to demonstrate my capabilities." Thompson leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with the expression of someone who had reached the limits of his patience. "Chun, let me be absolutely clear about something. In my 28 years of military service, I've seen what happens when people are promoted beyond their capabilities. I've watched good pilots die because someone made poor decisions about personnel assignments." The implication was unmistakable. Thompson was suggesting that Sarah's desire for flight assignments represented a danger to other pilots and military operations. It was a characterization that went beyond questions of qualification to fundamental issues of competence and judgment. "The F-16 Fighting Falcon is one of the most sophisticated fighter aircraft ever built," Thompson continued. "It requires pilots who can handle multiple complex systems simultaneously while making life-or-death decisions in seconds. That capability comes from years of progressive training and proven performance under pressure." Sarah understood the subtext immediately. Thompson was describing requirements that he believed she couldn't meet, not because of her training or qualifications, but because of assumptions about her physical and mental capabilities. The criteria he was outlining were applied equally to all candidates. They were weapons designed to exclude specific individuals from consideration. "My training records demonstrate proficiency with complex systems integration, sir. My academic research focused specifically on optimizing pilot decision-making under stress. I've completed advanced courses in tactical analysis and emergency response procedures." Thompson's response was swift and decisive. "Training records and academic research don't prepare you for real combat situations. When an enemy aircraft is locking onto your position, when you're pulling 6 Gs in a defensive maneuver, when your instruments are failing and you have 30 seconds to make a decision that determines whether you live or die, your simulator experience won't save you." The scenario Thompson described was vivid and terrifying, designed to highlight the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. But Sarah had studied these exact situations extensively, had run through hundreds of emergency scenarios in simulators, and had demonstrated the ability to maintain composure under extreme stress. "Sir, combat readiness requires extensive preparation and training, which is exactly what I've been requesting. Operational experience can only be gained through operational assignments. My background provides a strong foundation for that progression." Thompson closed the file folder with a sharp snap. "Chun, I'm going to give you some advice that you can either accept or ignore. Focus on the assignments you've been given. Develop expertise in areas where you can actually contribute to squadron effectiveness. Stop pursuing assignments that aren't appropriate for your background and capabilities." The conversation was clearly over, but Sarah couldn't let Thompson's characterization stand unchallenged. "Sir, what specific capabilities do you believe I lack? My qualifications meet or exceed the requirements outlined in military aviation protocols." Thompson's face flushed slightly, a sign that Sarah had pushed the conversation into territory he preferred to avoid. "Captain, this discussion is concluded. You have your assignments. Focus on executing those duties to the best of your ability." Sarah stood and prepared to leave, but Thompson's voice stopped her at the door. "Chun, let me give you one final piece of advice. The military doesn't change to accommodate individual ambitions. It operates according to principles that have been tested through decades of experience. Learn to work within those principles, or find yourself a different career." The threat was clear and unambiguous. Sarah could accept her current role and the limitations Thompson had imposed, or she could face consequences that would effectively end her military career. It was the kind of ultimatum that had forced many qualified officers to abandon their aspirations and settle for positions that utilized only a fraction of their capabilities. As Sarah walked back to her workstation, she could feel the eyes of other personnel tracking her movement. Word of Thompson's meeting spread quickly through the base, and everyone understood the implications of being called to his office. Some watched with sympathy, others with satisfaction, but all with the understanding that challenging Thompson's authority typically ended in defeat. The afternoon passed slowly as Sarah completed her assigned duties, monitoring communications and compiling reports that would be reviewed by the same pilots who had been mocking her qualifications that morning. The work was important but routine, requiring careful attention but offering no opportunities for the kind of contribution that might change perceptions about her capabilities. Major Patterson returned from his training flight with the swagger that characterized successful mission completion. His debriefing included detailed accounts of tactical maneuvers and system performance that demonstrated both his skill and his aircraft's capabilities. But Sarah noticed gaps in his analysis, missed opportunities for optimization that her engineering background would have identified immediately. "Chun," Patterson called out as he passed her workstation. "Hope you got some good data from our little air show today. Always happy to provide educational material for the support staff." The comment drew chuckles from the other pilots, but Sarah detected something else in Patterson's manner. Despite his confident facade, he had struggled with several aspects of the training exercise. His fuel consumption had been higher than optimal, his maneuvering efficiency had shown room for improvement, and his radio communications had included several instances of confusion about tactical positioning. "Captain." Martinez approached Sarah's desk with a mission report that required her analysis and signature. "Interesting morning out there," he said, his tone more neutral than Patterson's but still carrying an undertone of condescension. "Lot of moving parts to keep track of when you're actually up there flying." Sarah reviewed the report carefully, noting several discrepancies between Martinez's account and the data she had been monitoring from the operations center. His fuel consumption figures were inconsistent with his reported flight path, and his timing estimates didn't match the communications logs she had been maintaining. "Captain Martinez, I noticed some inconsistencies in your fuel consumption data. According to the flight path you've documented, your consumption should have been approximately 8% lower than what you've reported." Martinez's expression shifted from casual condescension to sharp attention. "What do you mean by inconsistencies?" Sarah pulled up the relevant data on her computer screen, highlighting the discrepancies she had identified. "Your reported fuel consumption doesn't align with your flight profile. Either your route was different from what you've documented, or there might be a mechanical issue affecting fuel efficiency." The observation was technically sound and potentially important for aircraft maintenance, but Martinez interpreted it as criticism of his flying or reporting accuracy. "Chun, I've been flying F-16s for 6 years. I think I know how to read my own instruments and document my own missions." The defensive response revealed Martinez's discomfort with having his performance questioned by someone he considered unqualified to evaluate pilot effectiveness. But Sarah's analysis was based on objective data and engineering principles that didn't require flight experience to understand. "Sir, I'm not questioning your flying ability. The data suggests a potential mechanical issue that might require maintenance attention. Fuel efficiency problems can indicate engine performance issues or hydraulic system irregularities." Martinez glanced around the operations center, aware that their conversation was being monitored by other personnel. Being corrected by Sarah represented a challenge to his authority and expertise that he couldn't allow to stand without response. "Captain Chun, stick to your assigned duties and let the pilots handle flight-related analysis. Your job is to compile reports, not to second-guess operational personnel." The exchange highlighted the fundamental problem Sarah faced at MacDill. Her technical knowledge and analytical skills were assets that could improve squadron effectiveness, but the existing culture interpreted her contributions as challenges to established authority rather than opportunities for improvement. As the day concluded and the pilots headed to debriefing sessions that Sarah wasn't invited to attend, she remained at her workstation, finishing reports and preparing data summaries that would be reviewed by officers who had made it clear they didn't value her input. The work was competent and thorough, but it represented a massive underutilization of capabilities that could benefit everyone involved. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she was analyzing the performance of pilots whose skills she had been studying and perfecting for years. She could identify inefficiencies in their fuel management, suggest improvements to their tactical positioning, and recommend modifications to their communication protocols. But that knowledge remained locked away, inaccessible to the squadron, because Thompson had decided that her gender and background made her unsuitable for meaningful contribution. That evening, as Sarah prepared to leave the operations center, she noticed a memo that had been posted on the squadron bulletin board. It described upcoming training exercises that would require additional pilot participation due to expanded mission requirements. The memo specifically mentioned that volunteer opportunities would be available for qualified personnel, subject to command approval. For the first time in months, Sarah felt a spark of possibility. The memo's language suggested that circumstances might be creating opportunities for non-traditional assignments. But she also understood that any attempt to volunteer would result in another confrontation with Thompson, one that might finally push their conflict beyond the point of professional recovery. As she gathered her materials and headed toward the parking lot, Sarah made a decision that would soon change everything at MacDill Air Force Base. She was done accepting limitations based on other people's assumptions about her capabilities. If Thompson wanted to exclude her from flight operations, he would have to provide reasons that went beyond traditional prejudices and personal preferences. The next morning would bring new challenges and opportunities that neither Sarah nor Thompson could anticipate. But Sarah was finally ready to stop asking for permission and start demanding the respect that her qualifications had already earned. 3 days after her confrontation with Colonel Thompson, Sarah arrived at the base to find her security clearance had been temporarily suspended, pending a routine review of her personnel file. The timing wasn't coincidental. The suspension effectively barred her from accessing classified flight data, technical manuals, and communication systems that were essential to her current duties, much less any future flight assignments. Master Sergeant Rebecca Hayes, the squadron's administrative coordinator, delivered the news with obvious discomfort. Captain Chun, I'm required to inform you that your access to Level 3 classified materials has been temporarily restricted. You'll need to report to the security office for processing and interview scheduling. The bureaucratic language couldn't disguise what was happening. Thompson was using administrative procedures as weapons, creating obstacles that would make Sarah's position increasingly untenable. A security review could drag on for months, during which time she would be effectively sidelined from any meaningful work. Sergeant Hayes, what specific concerns triggered this review? My security clearance has been current and uncontested for the past 8 years. Hayes glanced around nervously before responding in a lowered voice. Ma'am, the official documentation cites concerns about reliability and judgment in sensitive situations. I don't have additional details about the specific allegations. The phrase reliability and judgment was military code for questioning someone's fitness for duty. Thompson wasn't just blocking Sarah's advancement. He was attempting to destroy her career entirely by creating a paper trail that would follow her to any future assignment. Sarah spent the morning in the security office, answering detailed questions about her background, associations, and recent activities. The interview was conducted by Captain Robert Walsh, a security specialist who seemed genuinely confused about why Sarah's clearance was being reviewed. Captain Chun, I've reviewed your file extensively, and I can't identify any security concerns that would warrant this level of scrutiny. Your record is exemplary, your background checks are current, and there are no adverse reports in your personnel file. Walsh's confusion provided some relief, but Sarah understood that the review process itself was the punishment. Even if she was ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing, the investigation would be noted in her record and could be used to justify future discrimination. Captain Walsh, can you tell me who initiated this review? The timing seems unusual given that my last security update was completed just 6 months ago. Walsh consulted his computer screen, scrolling through administrative records. The request came from your commanding officer, Colonel Thompson. He cited concerns about your aggressive pursuit of assignments beyond your qualifications and suggested that additional scrutiny might be warranted. The language revealed Thompson's strategy clearly. He was characterizing Sarah's legitimate requests for flight assignments as evidence of poor judgment and potential security risks. It was a masterful use of bureaucratic procedures to create consequences without having to justify his decisions through normal channels. While Sarah was trapped in the security office, the squadron was conducting advanced tactical exercises that represented exactly the kind of training she had been requesting. 6 F-16s were practicing air-to-air combat scenarios, testing both pilot skills and aircraft capabilities under simulated combat conditions. But the exercise wasn't going well. Major Patterson's flight had encountered unexpected complications. When one of his wingmen, Lieutenant David Foster, experienced instrument failures during a high-G maneuver. Foster's aircraft was still airworthy, but his navigation and communication systems were operating erratically, creating safety concerns for the entire formation. From the control tower, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison watched the situation develop with growing concern. Foster was a competent pilot, but the instrument failures were testing his abilities beyond his experience level. The exercise should have been terminated immediately, but Patterson was pushing forward, reluctant to abort a training mission that had taken weeks to coordinate. Lightning II, report your status, Morrison radioed to Foster's aircraft. Control. I'm showing intermittent navigation errors and communication static. Instruments are giving conflicting readings on altitude and airspeed. Morrison's jaw tightened. Foster's situation was exactly the kind of emergency that required immediate analysis and decision-making. The pilot needed guidance from someone who understood F-16 systems thoroughly and could provide rapid troubleshooting assistance. What Morrison didn't know was that Sarah had encountered similar instrument failures during her simulator training and had developed diagnostic procedures that could quickly identify the root cause of Foster's problems. Her engineering background and extensive study of F-16 systems made her uniquely qualified to provide the technical support Foster needed. But Sarah was sitting in a security office, answering questions about her loyalty and judgment while a potentially dangerous situation developed overhead. The irony wasn't lost on Morrison, who was beginning to understand the true cost of Thompson's personnel policies. The situation deteriorated further when Foster's wingman, Captain Michael Stevens, reported hydraulic pressure fluctuations in his own aircraft. What had begun as a routine training exercise was becoming a multiple aircraft emergency that was testing the squadron's response capabilities. Control Lightning 3 is showing amber warnings on hydraulic system 2. Pressure is fluctuating between normal and minimum acceptable levels. Morrison felt his stomach drop. 2 aircraft with significant mechanical problems, flying in formation at high speed and altitude, represented a scenario that could quickly turn catastrophic. The squadron needed every available resource to manage the crisis effectively. All aircraft, this is Control. Exercise is terminated immediately. Lightning 2 and 3 begin immediate descent to pattern altitude and prepare for emergency landing procedures. But Patterson's voice crackled through the radio with frustration and defiance. Control, we can complete the exercise. Foster's instruments are readable, and Stevens' hydraulics are still within acceptable parameters. We've invested too much. Preparation time to abort now. Morrison's hands clenched involuntarily. Patterson was letting his ego override his judgment, exactly the kind of decision-making that got pilots killed. The Major was more concerned about completing his mission than about the safety of his wingmen. Major Patterson, this is a direct order. Terminate the exercise immediately and bring your aircraft back to base. We have 2 pilots with compromised systems who need immediate attention. The radio fell silent for a long moment before Patterson's voice returned, tight with barely controlled anger. Control, Lightning flight returning to base as directed. As the aircraft began their emergency descent, Morrison found himself thinking about Sarah's security review and the timing of her suspension. The squadron was dealing with exactly the kind of technical crisis where her expertise could have made a crucial difference. Her knowledge of F-16 systems and troubleshooting procedures could have helped identify solutions that might prevent similar failures in the future. Meanwhile, Sarah's interview continued with increasingly detailed questions about her motivations and career goals. Captain Walsh was clearly uncomfortable with the direction the questioning was taking, but he was following protocols that had been established by Thompson's office. Captain Chun, can you explain your persistent requests for flight assignments? Despite being informed that such assignments weren't appropriate for your background? The question was loaded with assumptions that Sarah had been hoping to avoid. Walsh was essentially asking her to defend her ambitions and explain why she couldn't accept the limitations that had been imposed on her. Captain Walsh, my requests for flight assignments have been based on my qualifications and training. I hold advanced certifications in F-16 systems. I've completed extensive simulator training, and I have over 400 hours of flight experience. My requests have been reasonable and appropriate. Walsh typed her response into his computer, but his expression suggested that he was beginning to understand the real nature of the investigation. Captain, off the record, this review seems unusual. Your background checks are exemplary. Your performance evaluations are outstanding. and I can't identify any legitimate security concerns." The admission confirmed what Sarah had suspected from the beginning. The security review was a pretext for harassment, designed to create bureaucratic obstacles that would force her to abandon her career goals or transfer to a different assignment. While the interview continued, Foster and Stevens successfully landed their aircraft despite the mechanical problems that had compromised their training exercise. But the debriefing revealed serious issues with the squadron's emergency response procedures and technical support. Capabilities. The instrument failures could have been diagnosed and resolved much faster if we'd had better technical analysis, Foster reported during his post-flight interview. "I was flying blind for 20 minutes because nobody could tell me what was causing the navigation errors." Stevens nodded in agreement. The hydraulic problems might have been preventable if someone had been monitoring system performance more carefully during pre-flight checks. "We need better technical oversight and diagnostic capabilities." Morrison listened to the debriefing with growing frustration. The pilots were describing exactly the kind of problems that Sarah's expertise could have prevented or resolved. Her engineering background and systems knowledge represented precisely the technical capabilities the squadron was lacking, but Thompson's response to the emergency was characteristically dismissive. "Equipment failures are part of military aviation. Pilots need to learn to handle these situations without excessive technical support. That's what separates competent aviators from people who rely too heavily on ground assistance." The attitude revealed Thompson's fundamental misunderstanding of modern military aviation. Contemporary fighter aircraft were complex systems that required sophisticated technical support and analysis. His preference for traditional approaches was actually compromising squadron effectiveness and pilot safety. As Sarah's security interview finally concluded, she was informed that the review process would continue for an indefinite period. Her access to classified materials would remain suspended, and her duty assignments would be modified to accommodate her reduced clearance level. "Captain Chun, you'll be reassigned to general administrative duties until the security review is completed," Captain Walsh explained. "I want you to know that this decision wasn't based on any findings from today's interview. The process is being driven by administrative requirements that are beyond my control." The reassignment was the final insult. Sarah was being demoted from technical analysis work to basic clerical duties, effectively removing her from any position where she could contribute to squadron operations. Thompson had successfully maneuvered her into a role that would force her to either accept permanent marginalization or resign from the military entirely. But as Sarah walked back to the operations building, she overheard conversations about the morning's emergency and the technical problems that had compromised the training exercise. Foster and Stevens were discussing their mechanical failures with ground crew members, describing symptoms that Sarah recognized immediately from her engineering studies. The navigation problems Foster had experienced were consistent with GPS antenna interference, a known issue that could be resolved through specific diagnostic procedures. Stevens' hydraulic fluctuations suggested pressure regulator problems that were predictable and preventable through proper maintenance protocols. Sarah realized that the squadron was struggling with exactly the kind of technical challenges that her background had prepared her to address. While Thompson was using administrative procedures to exclude her from meaningful work, the pilots were dealing with problems that her expertise could solve effectively. That evening, as Sarah reviewed her options and considered her next steps, she began to understand that Thompson's escalating campaign against her had created an opportunity she hadn't anticipated. His obvious harassment and the timing of the security review had demonstrated a pattern of discrimination that could no longer be dismissed as routine personnel management. More importantly, the day's emergency had revealed gaps in the squadron's technical capabilities that were affecting pilot safety and mission effectiveness. Sarah's forced removal from technical duties had created Problems that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. As she prepared her personal files and documentation that evening, Sarah made a decision that would soon transform her relationship with everyone at MacDill Air Force Base. She was done playing defense against Thompson's bureaucratic attacks. It was time to go on the offensive and demonstrate exactly what the squadron was losing through his discriminatory policies. The next phase of their conflict would be fought on different terms, with stakes that neither Thompson nor Sarah could fully anticipate. But Sarah was finally ready to stop accepting limitations and start proving that her qualifications were exactly what the squadron needed to function effectively. The morning would bring new challenges and opportunities that would test everyone's assumptions about capability, authority, and what it really meant to serve effectively in modern military aviation. Sarah's apartment that night looked like a war room. Technical manuals covered every surface of her dining table. Military regulations were spread across the floor in organized stacks, and her laptop displayed multiple documents detailing Air Force protocols and procedures. For the first time in 18 months, she wasn't studying to improve her qualifications. She was researching to find a way around the bureaucratic walls that Thompson had constructed around her career. The security clearance suspension had been Thompson's tactical error. In his eagerness to sideline Sarah completely, he had used procedures that left a documented trail of discriminatory actions. More importantly, his timing had coincided with operational problems that highlighted exactly the kind of technical expertise the squadron was lacking. Sarah's legal training from her undergraduate studies had taught her to approach problems systematically, building cases through careful documentation and strategic analysis. Thompson might have military authority, but military authority was constrained by regulations and procedures that applied equally to everyone, regardless of rank or personal preferences. The first document she examined was her original security clearance application, submitted 8 years earlier when she had first joined the Air Force. Every detail of her background had been thoroughly investigated and approved without reservation. Her financial records were clean, her personal associations were appropriate, and her psychological evaluations had been exemplary. The second document was Thompson's formal request for security review, submitted just 3 days after their confrontational meeting in his office. The timing was damning, but the language was even more revealing. Thompson had cited concerns about reliability and judgment in sensitive situations, without providing specific examples or evidence to support his allegations. Military regulations required that security reviews be based on objective evidence of potential risks or compromised loyalty. Thompson's request contained subjective opinions and personal interpretations that didn't meet the evidentiary standards required for such serious action. He had overreached, and Sarah was beginning to understand how to use his overreach against him. The third document was the squadron's operational report from the morning's emergency, detailing the instrument failures and hydraulic problems that had compromised the F-16 training exercise. The report identified technical gaps in diagnostic capabilities and recommended improved support for pilots dealing with equipment malfunctions. What the report didn't mention was that those technical gaps could have been filled by Sarah's expertise, because Thompson's administrative actions had removed her from any position where she could contribute to problem solving. The timing created a clear connection between discriminatory personnel decisions and reduced operational effectiveness. Sarah spent 3 hours that night cross-referencing military regulations with the specific actions Thompson had taken against her. Air Force Instruction 362406 prohibited discrimination based on gender in assignment decisions. Air Force Instruction 31-501 required objective evidence for security clearance reviews. Air Force Instruction 362110 mandated fair consideration of qualified personnel for available positions. Thompson had violated multiple regulations while attempting to exclude Sarah from flight assignments. but violations of military regulations were meaningless unless they could be documented and presented through proper channels. Sarah needed evidence, witnesses, and a strategy that would force a fair evaluation of her qualifications. The breakthrough came when Sarah discovered Air Force Instruction 11-401, which governed pilot training and certification requirements. Buried in Section 4.3.2 was a provision that she had never noticed before. Qualified personnel may request emergency certification for operational assignments when squadron requirements exceed available pilot resources. The language was technical and rarely used, but it provided a pathway for extraordinary circumstances that exactly matched the squadron's current situation. Foster and Stevens' emergency had revealed pilot workload issues that were affecting training schedules and operational readiness. The squadron was struggling to meet mission requirements with available personnel. Sarah began documenting the squadron's pilot shortage systematically. Training exercises were being delayed due to insufficient crews. Maintenance test flights were being postponed because no pilots were available to perform routine evaluations. Aircraft were sitting idle while waiting for pilot certification that could have been provided by qualified personnel who were being excluded from consideration. The data painted a clear picture of operational inefficiency caused by artificial restrictions on pilot assignments. Thompson's personal preferences were creating practical problems that affected the entire squadron's effectiveness. But Sarah needed more than documentation to challenge his authority successfully. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the base early and headed directly to the base library's legal research section. Air Force regulations filled entire shelves, but Sarah was looking for specific precedents that might support her case. She needed examples of successful challenges to discriminatory assignment decisions. What she found was even better than precedents. She found Inspector General Instruction 90-301, which established procedures for investigating and resolving complaints about unlawful discrimination and reprisal. The instruction provided a formal mechanism for challenging Thompson's actions while protecting Sarah from additional retaliation. The Inspector General process was designed to be independent of normal command authority. Thompson couldn't interfere with an IG investigation, and the investigators were required to examine evidence objectively, without regard to the personal preferences of commanding officers. It was exactly the kind of external oversight that could force a fair evaluation of Sarah's situation, but filing an IG complaint was a serious step that would escalate the conflict beyond any possibility of resolution through normal channels. Sarah would be formally accusing Thompson of discrimination and abuse of authority. If the investigation supported her allegations, Thompson could face career-ending consequences. If it didn't, Sarah's military career would effectively be over. While Sarah was researching legal options, the squadron was dealing with new complications from the previous day's emergency. Foster's F-16 required extensive diagnostic testing to identify the root cause of his instrument failures. Stevens' aircraft needed hydraulic system inspection that would keep it grounded for at least a week. 2. Aircraft out of service meant that upcoming training exercises would have to be modified or canceled entirely. The squadron's operational tempo was being disrupted by technical problems that could have been prevented through better maintenance protocols and diagnostic procedures. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison found himself managing crisis situations that were becoming increasingly difficult to resolve with available resources. The squadron needed technical expertise that could identify patterns in equipment failures and develop preventive maintenance strategies. But Thompson's personnel policies had eliminated access to exactly that kind of analytical capability. Morrison's frustration was growing, but his position as deputy commander limited his ability to challenge Thompson's decisions directly. He could provide input and recommendations, but ultimate authority rested with Thompson, who showed no signs of reconsidering his approach to Personnel management. The situation was further complicated by pressure from higher command levels to maintain training schedules and operational readiness despite the equipment problems. Group headquarters was demanding explanations for delayed exercises and reduced mission capability, creating additional stress for everyone involved. Morrison began to understand that the squadron's technical problems weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of systematic issues that required comprehensive solutions rather than reactive responses to individual emergencies. The kind of systematic analysis that Sarah's background had prepared her to provide. That afternoon, Sarah made a decision that would change the trajectory of her conflict with Thompson permanently. She would file a formal Inspector General complaint alleging discrimination and abuse of authority. But before taking that irreversible step, she would make one final attempt to resolve the situation through normal channels. Sarah requested a meeting with Morrison, carefully avoiding any mention of her planned legal action. Morrison represented her best hope of finding a reasonable solution that wouldn't require external intervention. He had shown signs of understanding the squadron's technical needs, and his position gave him influence over assignment decisions. The meeting took place in Morrison's office, away from the operations center where their conversation might be overheard by other personnel. Sarah had prepared a comprehensive presentation that documented the squadron's operational problems and demonstrated how her expertise could contribute to solutions. "Sir, I've been analyzing the technical issues that have been affecting our training exercises. The equipment failures we've experienced follow predictable patterns that could be prevented through improved diagnostic procedures and maintenance protocols." Morrison leaned forward, clearly interested in Sarah's analysis. "What kind of patterns are you seeing?" Sarah opened her laptop and displayed a series of charts and graphs that illustrated equipment failure trends over the past 6 months. Navigation system problems like Lieutenant Foster experienced typically result from GPS antenna interference caused by improper maintenance procedures. The hydraulic issues Captain Stevens encountered are usually early indicators of pressure regulator wear that can be detected through routine testing. The presentation was impressive, demonstrating analytical capabilities that exceeded anything currently available to the squadron. Morrison could see immediately how Sarah's expertise could improve operational effectiveness and pilot safety. "This is exactly the kind of analysis we need," Morrison admitted. "Our current maintenance protocols are reactive rather than preventive. We're dealing with failures after they occur instead of preventing them before they become problems." Sarah felt a surge of hope. Morrison was responding to her technical capabilities rather than focusing on her gender or background. For the first time in months, she was being evaluated based on what she could contribute rather than assumptions about what she couldn't do. "Sir, my engineering background includes specific training in failure analysis and preventive maintenance strategies. I could develop protocols that would significantly reduce equipment failures and improve aircraft availability for training exercises." Morrison nodded slowly, clearly weighing the benefits of Sarah's expertise against the political complications of challenging Thompson's personnel decisions. "Captain Chun, your analysis is compelling, and we definitely need this kind of technical support. But Colonel Thompson has made his position clear about flight-related assignments." The response revealed Morrison's dilemma perfectly. He could see the operational benefits of utilizing Sarah's capabilities, but he was constrained by Thompson's authority and unwilling to challenge his commander's decisions directly. "Sir, this wouldn't necessarily require flight assignments. Technical analysis and maintenance protocol development could be handled through engineering support roles that wouldn't conflict with Colonel Thompson's concerns about operational assignments." Sarah was offering Morrison a compromise that could provide the squadron with needed technical expertise while avoiding direct confrontation with Thompson's pilot assignment policies. It was a reasonable solution that addressed operational needs without challenging existing authority structures Morrison considered the proposal carefully. "Let me discuss this with Colonel Thompson. Your analysis demonstrates capabilities we need, and there might be ways to incorporate your expertise into our technical support structure." The meeting ended with cautious optimism, but Sarah understood that Morrison's ability to influence Thompson was limited. If Thompson rejected the technical support compromise, Sarah would proceed with her Inspector General complaint and formal challenge to his discriminatory policies. That evening, Sarah completed her documentation for the IG complaint, carefully organizing evidence and witness statements that supported her allegations. The complaint was comprehensive and devastating, detailing Thompson's pattern of discrimination and demonstrating how his personal prejudices were affecting squadron operations, but she decided to wait 48 hours before submitting the complaint, giving Morrison time to present the technical support compromise to Thompson. If Thompson was willing to utilize her expertise in any meaningful capacity, she might be able to achieve her goals without resorting to formal legal action. The next 2 days would determine whether the conflict could be resolved through negotiation, or would escalate into a formal investigation that could end careers and transform the squadron's culture permanently. Sarah was prepared for either outcome, but she hoped that reason and operational necessity would prevail over prejudice and traditional thinking. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everyone's priorities and determine whether competence or politics would ultimately shape personnel decisions at MacDill Air Force Base. The morning of the third day arrived with an emergency that would shatter every assumption at MacDill Air Force Base at 0545 hours. While Sarah was reviewing her Inspector General complaint one final time, the squadron alarm system activated with the piercing wail that indicated a real-world crisis rather than a training exercise. Captain David Foster's voice crackled through the emergency communication system, tight with stress and barely controlled panic. "Mayday, mayday, MacDill Control. Lightning 7 experiencing complete electrical failure at 15,000 feet. All navigation and communication systems are down. I'm flying blind in zero visibility conditions." In the control tower, chaos erupted as controllers scrambled to establish contact with Foster's aircraft. The F-16 was somewhere in a dense cloud bank over the Gulf of Mexico, invisible to ground radar and unable to communicate reliably. Foster was essentially flying a $30 million aircraft with 19th century navigation capabilities. Colonel Thompson burst into the operations center, his face grim as he absorbed the situation reports streaming in from multiple sources. "How many qualified pilots do we have available for immediate search and rescue support?" Master Sergeant Hayes consulted her duty roster with increasing alarm. "Sir, Major Patterson is grounded with a medical restriction. Captain Martinez is on emergency leave. Captain Stevens' aircraft is still down for hydraulic repairs. We have 2 pilots available, but both are junior officers with limited experience in emergency operations." Thompson's jaw clenched as he realized the squadron's pilot shortage had created a crisis at the worst possible moment. Foster needed experienced aviators who could locate his aircraft and provide guidance for emergency landing procedures. The available pilots lacked the expertise to handle such a complex rescue operation. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison stepped forward, his voice urgent. "Sir, we need every available resource for this operation. Foster's electrical failure means he can't use standard navigation procedures. Someone needs to talk him through manual flight techniques while search aircraft establish visual contact." The unspoken reality hung in the air like smoke. The squadron needed pilot expertise that exceeded what was immediately available. Foster's life depended on technical knowledge and flight experience that was sitting unused in administrative assignments. Sarah heard the emergency alerts from her desk in the administrative section, where Thompson's security review had relegated. Heard of filing reports and managing paperwork. Through the windows she could see ground crews preparing search and rescue equipment while controllers attempted to re-establish communication with Foster's aircraft. The technical details of Foster's emergency were immediately familiar to Sarah from her extensive study of F-16 electrical systems. Complete electrical failure typically resulted from generator malfunction or main power bus failure, both of which followed predictable patterns that could be diagnosed and potentially resolved through specific procedures. More importantly, Sarah understood that Foster's survival depended on someone who could guide him through manual flight techniques while maintaining calm communication under extreme stress. The emergency required exactly the combination of technical expertise in flight, knowledge that her background had prepared her to provide. As the crisis deepened and available options dwindled, Morrison made a decision that would change everything. At MacDill Air Force Base, he walked directly to Sarah's desk, his expression grim but determined. "Captain Chun, I need your expertise immediately. We have a pilot in distress who needs technical guidance that exceeds our current capabilities. Your knowledge of electrical systems could save his life." Sarah looked up from her paperwork, understanding immediately that Morrison was offering her the opportunity she had been seeking for 18 months. But the circumstances were far more serious than anything she had imagined. Foster's life hung in the balance, and failure would have consequences that extended far beyond career advancement. "Sir, what's Captain Foster's specific situation?" Morrison briefed her rapidly on the electrical failure and communication problems, while leading her toward the operations center. "He's flying manually in zero visibility conditions. We need someone who understands F-16 electrical systems and can provide troubleshooting guidance through intermittent radio contact." As they entered the operations center, every conversation stopped. Thompson's face darkened when he saw Sarah approaching the communication stations, but Morrison's expression made it clear that this wasn't a request for permission. "Colonel Thompson, Captain Chun has the technical expertise we need to help Foster diagnose his electrical problems. Her engineering background makes her uniquely qualified to provide the guidance he needs." Thompson's response was swift and decisive. "Morrison, Chun is not qualified for emergency operations. Her security clearance is under review, and she has no authorization for operational assignments." The objection revealed Thompson's priorities clearly. Even with a pilot's life at stake, he was more concerned about maintaining his personnel policies than utilizing available expertise. But Morrison had reached the limits of his patience with bureaucratic obstacles. "Sir, Foster needs help that we can't provide with available personnel. Chun's qualifications are exactly what this situation requires." Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm despite the tension filling the room. "Colonel Thompson, I volunteer to provide technical assistance for this emergency. My clearance restrictions don't apply to life-saving operations, and my expertise could prevent a fatality." The statement was technically accurate and legally sound. Emergency operations superseded normal administrative restrictions and withholding. Qualified assistance during a life-threatening crisis could itself constitute a violation of military regulations. Thompson found himself trapped between his personal prejudices and operational necessity. Refusing to allow Sarah to help Foster would be difficult to justify if the emergency ended tragically. But utilizing her expertise would undermine the authority structure he had worked 18 months to maintain. The decision was made for him when Foster's voice crackled through the radio again, weaker and more desperate than before. "MacDill. Control, Lightning 7. I'm losing altitude and can't maintain level flight. Fuel is getting critical, and I can't find the runway in these clouds." Morrison turned to Sarah without waiting for Thompson's permission. "Chun, you're our best option. Talk to Foster and see if you can help him restore electrical power." Sarah moved to the communication station, her hands steady as she adjusted the radio frequency and prepared to establish contact with Foster's aircraft. 18 months of preparation and study were about to be tested under the most demanding circumstances possible. "Lightning 7, this is MacDill Operations. Captain. Chun speaking. I'm here to help you troubleshoot your electrical system. Can you describe exactly what happened when your power failed? Foster's response came through heavy static, but his relief at hearing technical assistance was audible. Operations, I was in a climbing turn when everything went dark. All instrument panels went dead simultaneously. Emergency lighting is working, but navigation and communication systems are intermittent. Sarah's training immediately identified the problem. Lightning 7, that pattern indicates main generator failure with partial backup power. I'm going to walk you through emergency power restoration procedures. First, locate the emergency electrical panel on your left console. The next 20 minutes tested every aspect of Sarah's knowledge and composure as she guided Foster through complex diagnostic procedures, while he fought to maintain control of his aircraft in deteriorating weather conditions. Her voice remained calm and professional, providing technical guidance with the precision of an experienced instructor. Foster's voice came through the radio with renewed strength and obvious relief. MacDill Operations, Lightning 7. I have partial electrical restoration. Navigation systems are coming back online, and I can see the runway approach lights through the cloud break. The operations center erupted in controlled celebration as Foster's aircraft appeared on radar screens, descending steadily toward MacDill's main runway. Sarah had successfully guided him through emergency procedures that restored enough electrical power to enable safe landing operations. Lightning 7, you're cleared for emergency landing on runway 09. Fire and rescue equipment is standing by. Foster's F-16 touched down smoothly despite the electrical problems that had threatened his life just an hour earlier. Emergency. Crews surrounded the aircraft as it rolled to a stop, but Foster was already climbing out of the cockpit, his relief visible even from the control tower. The immediate crisis was over, but the implications were just beginning to register throughout the squadron. Sarah had demonstrated technical expertise under extreme pressure that exceeded the capabilities of anyone else on the base. Her performance during the emergency couldn't be dismissed or explained away through bureaucratic rationalization. Colonel Thompson stood in stunned silence, watching as Foster walked across the tarmac toward the operations building. The pilot was alive because of Sarah's expertise, and everyone in the operations center understood exactly what had happened. Thompson's 18-month campaign to exclude Sarah from meaningful assignments had been shattered by 20 minutes of undeniable competence. Major Patterson, who had been monitoring the emergency from his medical restriction status, approached Sarah with an expression she had never seen before. The condescension and mockery were gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine respect. Chun, that was incredible work. Foster's alive because you knew exactly how to handle that electrical failure. I've never seen anyone talk a pilot through those procedures with that level of precision. The acknowledgement meant more to Sarah than months of formal recognition could have provided. Patterson was admitting that her technical knowledge had practical value that exceeded his own capabilities. It was the first time any of the squadron pilots had recognized her expertise openly. Captain Martinez joined the conversation, his tone subdued but sincere. I owe you an apology, Captain Chen. I've been treating you like you didn't belong here, but what you just did proves that we need your expertise more than we realized. The admissions were spreading through the operations center as personnel who had witnessed the emergency began to understand the full scope of what had occurred. Sarah hadn't just provided technical assistance. She had demonstrated leadership under pressure that many of the squadron's pilots had never experienced. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison approached Sarah with obvious satisfaction. Chun, that was outstanding work. Your technical knowledge and communication skills saved Foster's life. I want you to know that your performance today will be documented in my official report. The promise of formal recognition was important, but Sarah was more focused on the changing atmosphere in the operations center. The hostile stares and dismissive comments had been replaced by professional acknowledgement and genuine appreciation for her capabilities. Foster himself entered the operations center an hour later, still wearing his flight suit and carrying his helmet under his arm. His first action was to walk directly to Sarah's workstation and extend his hand in gratitude. "Captain Chun, I want to thank you personally for saving my life today. Your guidance through those electrical procedures was perfect. I couldn't have made it back without your expertise." Foster's statement carried special weight because of his reputation as one of the squadron's most capable pilots. His acknowledgement of Sarah's contribution couldn't be dismissed as political correctness or bureaucratic protocol. It was a pilot recognizing superior technical knowledge from someone who had demonstrated competence under life or death pressure. But Thompson's response revealed the depth of his resistance to changing established authority structures. "Foster, I'm glad you're safe, but let's not overstate the situation." Chun provided basic technical assistance that any qualified engineer could have delivered. The characterization was so obviously inaccurate that it drew shocked stares from everyone who had monitored the emergency. Sarah's guidance had been sophisticated, precise, and delivered under extreme pressure with perfect composure. Thompson's attempt to minimize her contribution revealed his unwillingness to acknowledge reality. Morrison's response was immediate and decisive. "Colonel Thompson, with respect, Captain Chun's performance was exceptional by any standard. Her technical knowledge and communication skills under pressure exceeded anything I've seen from our current personnel." The public disagreement between Thompson and Morrison marked a fundamental shift in squadron dynamics. Morrison was openly challenging Thompson's characterization of Sarah's abilities, creating space for other personnel to express their genuine assessments without fear of retribution. Master Sergeant Hayes, who had been monitoring communications throughout the emergency, added her own perspective. "Sir, Captain Chun's radio procedures were textbook perfect. She maintained calm communication throughout the crisis and provided guidance that was technically accurate and clearly communicated. The support was building from multiple sources, creating a consensus that Thompson couldn't ignore or dismiss." Through administrative maneuvering, Sarah's performance during the emergency had demonstrated capabilities that demanded recognition, regardless of personal prejudices or traditional expectations. 3 weeks after Foster's emergency rescue, the transformation at MacDill Air Force Base was unmistakable. Sarah's desk had been moved from the administrative section to the Technical Operations Center, where her engineering expertise was being utilized to develop comprehensive maintenance protocols and diagnostic procedures. The official recognition came in the form of a commendation for exceptional performance during emergency operations. But the practical changes were more significant than any formal award. Sarah was finally being consulted on technical decisions that affected squadron operations, and her recommendations were being implemented with results that exceeded expectations. The aircraft maintenance protocol she developed had reduced equipment failures by 60% over the 3-week period following Foster's emergency. Her diagnostic procedures had identified potential problems before they became critical issues, preventing several situations that could have resulted in emergency landings or aircraft losses. More importantly, the squadron's training effectiveness had improved dramatically as aircraft availability increased and pilot confidence grew. The technical support Sarah provided had eliminated many of the uncertainties that had been affecting mission planning and execution. Foster had become one of Sarah's strongest advocates, describing her technical assistance to anyone who would listen. "Chun saved my life, but she also showed all of us what real technical expertise looks like. We should have been utilizing her knowledge from the beginning." The comment reflected a broader recognition that Thompson's personnel policies had been wasting valuable resources while compromising operational effectiveness. Sarah's expertise represented exactly the kind of technical capability that modern military aviation required. Captain Martinez had completely reversed his attitude towards Sarah. seeking her input on technical issues and publicly acknowledging her contributions during squadron briefings. I was wrong about Chun's qualifications. Her engineering background gives her insights that improve everyone's performance. The admission required significant personal growth from Martinez, but it also reflected the squadron's evolving culture. Technical competence was being recognized and valued regardless of traditional expectations about gender roles in military aviation. Major Patterson's transformation was even more dramatic. He had requested that Sarah review his flight techniques and provide recommendations for improving his aircraft handling efficiency. Chun understands these systems better than anyone on the base. Her advice has made me a better pilot. The acknowledgement from Patterson carried special significance because of his previous role as one of Sarah's most vocal critics. His willingness to seek her technical guidance demonstrated how completely the squadron's dynamics had changed. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had been promoted to acting squadron commander after Thompson was reassigned to a staff position at group headquarters. Morrison's first official action was to recommend Sarah for immediate consideration for flight status and operational assignments. Captain Chun has demonstrated technical expertise and leadership capabilities that exceed our current operational requirements. She should be flying our aircraft, not just maintaining them. The recommendation initiated a formal review process that would evaluate Sarah's qualifications for pilot certification and operational assignments. But the review was being conducted by personnel who had witnessed her performance during Foster's emergency, ensuring a fair evaluation based on demonstrated competence. The formal flight evaluation began 4 weeks after the emergency, with Sarah finally seated in the cockpit of an F-16 Fighting Falcon for her first official test flight. The aircraft systems that she had studied theoretically for years were now responding to her direct control. The pre-flight inspection revealed the depth of her technical knowledge as she identified potential issues that had escaped the attention of ground crew members. Her understanding of aircraft systems translated directly into superior preparation and safety protocols. The takeoff was smooth and controlled, demonstrating flight skills that exceeded the performance of most newly certified pilots. Sarah's extensive simulator training and theoretical knowledge had prepared her for the practical realities of high-performance aircraft operation, but the real test came during advanced maneuvers that challenged both her technical understanding and her physical capabilities. Sarah executed tactical turns, emergency procedures, and combat simulations with precision that impressed the evaluating instructors. Chun's performance is exceptional, reported Captain James Wilson, the chief flight instructor. Her technical knowledge gives her advantages that most pilots don't develop until they've accumulated hundreds of operational hours. The evaluation concluded with Sarah receiving full certification for F-16 operations, making her eligible for all squadron assignments that had been denied for 18 months. But more importantly, she had proven that competence and preparation could overcome any bureaucratic obstacle. 6 months later, Sarah was leading training exercises and mentoring junior pilots who sought her technical expertise in flight instruction. Her unique combination of engineering knowledge and operational skills had made her one of the squadron's most valuable assets. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the officer Thompson had tried to exclude was now training the pilots he had considered more qualified. Sarah's success had exposed the fundamental flaws in traditional approaches to personnel evaluation and assignment. Foster, who had returned to full flight status, often flew as Sarah's wingman during training exercises. Having Chun as flight leader gives me confidence that someone with real technical knowledge is making tactical decisions. She understands these aircraft better than anyone. The relationship between Foster and Sarah had evolved into a professional partnership that demonstrated how technical expertise and operational experience could complement each other effectively. Their flight set new standards for precision and safety that other crews worked to emulate. Thompson's reassignment had been presented as a routine personnel rotation, but everyone understood the real reasons for his departure. His inability to recognize and utilize Sarah's capabilities had compromised squadron effectiveness and demonstrated poor judgment that couldn't be overlooked by higher command. His replacement, Colonel Patricia Davis, arrived with a reputation for valuing competence over tradition and technical expertise over conventional expectations. Her first meeting with Sarah focused on ways to expand the technical support programs that had proven so successful. "Captain Chun, I've reviewed your performance record and the improvements you've brought to squadron operations. I want to discuss how we can build on your successes and develop similar technical capabilities throughout our organization." The conversation marked the completion of Sarah's transformation from excluded outsider to essential team member. Her expertise was being recognized, her contributions were being valued, and her potential was being developed rather than constrained. As Sarah walked across the flight line that evening, preparing for another training mission, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The laughter and mockery that had once followed her movements had been replaced by respectful acknowledgement and genuine appreciation. She had never asked for special treatment or lowered standards. She had simply demanded the opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities and prove her worth through performance rather than prejudice. The 18 months of exclusion and discrimination had tested her resolve, but they had also prepared her for the challenges she now faced as a leader and instructor. The squadron's transformation reflected broader changes in military aviation that recognized technical expertise as essential for modern operations. Sarah's success had demonstrated that competence came in many forms, and that artificial barriers only weakened organizational effectiveness. As her F-16 lifted off into the Florida sunset, Sarah understood that she had found her place not just in the cockpit, but in the evolving culture of military aviation. The fighter jet responded to her commands with precision and power, carrying her toward a future where capability would always triumph over prejudice, and where respect would be earned through performance rather than granted through tradition. The sound of her engine echoed across MacDill Air Force Base, a reminder to everyone who heard it that excellence couldn't be contained by conventional expectations, and that those who laughed at ambition would eventually watch in silence as competence soared above their limitations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.